Hey guys, Spudknocker here, as always, and today we're going to take a look at the two new pointer modes for the Lightning targeting pod in the A-18C Hornet. Now this small but very welcome addition to the targeting pod in the A-18C will make your life a heck of a lot easier when it comes to acquiring and then engaging ground targets in the A-18C in the heat of combat. Now these two modes are the Waypoint pointer mode as well as the VVSL or Velocity Vector Slave mode for the Lightning targeting pod. This allows you to either slave the pod to a pre-designated waypoint that you can add to your mission computer in the way of coordinates, as well as being able to slave your targeting pod to the velocity vector to aid you in getting that pod on a certain point on the ground very, very easily and effectively. Like I said, it'll definitely make your life a lot easier when it comes to finding and then engaging ground targets in the F-18C. Now when it comes time to practice using the Lightning pod in the F-18 or in the F-16 or any other jet that has a targeting pod, I really recommend hopping onto the Persian Gulf map and putting some targets on an island like Greater Tomb Island and then using that as your practice medium. Because having that small geographic area of an island in the middle of an ocean, quite literally, of nothingness, will really help you in being able to learn how to acquire that island and then a target on that island very easily and effectively. And then of course you can expand your practice areas from there by moving to a larger island like maybe Keshem Island or something like that, or maybe even part of the Kasab or / Omani Peninsula, something like that, to keep expanding and allow yourself to find targets better and better in larger and larger geographic areas. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and as always, thanks for watching, guys. Alrighty guys, here we are in the office of the F-18C, and we'll go ahead and get her set up for some air-to-ground work with some AGM-65E laser-guided Mavericks and a couple GBU-12s. We got ourselves a double ugly loadout with a couple Mavericks and two GBU-12s on a Brew 33 down there on our inboard left-hand station. So we'll go ahead and start setting ourselves up here. We'll bring the master arm back into arm because it was already there. Whoops. We'll bring it into air-to-ground mode here, and we'll go ahead and arm our laser designator down there, and we'll bring up our FLIR. Now on the grayscale DDIs, or sorry, greenscale DDIs that we have here in the F-18, I really don't like using CCD mode. The TV mode just doesn't have enough contrast and isn't, I find it very hard to find targets and identify targets, so I always flip this guy over into FLIR mode right away. I find that white hot is the best mode to use on these greenscale DDIs. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and set up our weapons and get these guys ready for use. So eFuse to instantaneous code, we'll just use the default 1688 laser code for DCS World. And I'll go over here to code 1688 once again to get our Mavericks ready to go. And first, why don't we engage targets with our two GBU-12 500-pound laser-guided bombs. So when we don't have a target designated within the computer system of the F-18C, our FLIR pod here, our Lightning pod, is always going to be in snowplow mode. And so snowplow mode is looking roughly about 45 degrees nose down. So it's roughly looking in kind of this sort of area. Now, some people find it useful for when you're flying over things, so say an island or a peninsula, some geographical object that you can find pretty easily. You can find targets that way in snowplow mode. I personally don't find this to be very useful in any of the jets that use targeting pods in DCS World, the F-18, Harrier, the F-16, the F-14, etc. But some people do find it useful. So we're going to go ahead and kind of set up a bit of a scenario here for us to work with. Now let's go ahead and say that we're working with a airborne forward air controller, a FAC-A, who's flying in an F-14B Tomcat, and he's circling around Greater Tomb Island out here. But he's having an issue. He is no longer able to use his laser. Say it burned out. It didn't work coming off the carrier deck. It was been jostled around quite a bit on this deployment and just broke on us. And so we have to figure out additional ways to find those targets other than laser spot track, which would be pretty darn easy and really automatic. So he's still able to pass us coordinates of targets, so we entered in a bunch of different waypoints into our navigation database within the FA-18C's mission computer, and so we're just going to use those in order to demonstrate the waypoint point mode for the lightning targeting pod, as well as we'll go into VVSL for velocity vector slave for the targeting pod as well after we go through those waypoints. So let's say that he's passed us a couple different waypoints here that we can use, so we'll go ahead and put the autopilot back on. We're flying off to the right-hand side of Greater Tomb Island because our targeting pod is on our left-hand side of our jet, so that way we didn't mask our pod. If we flew off to the left, we'd be masking our pod with the nose and fuselage of our jet. So first, we'll go ahead and take a look at waypoint 1. Now, that FAC-A, he told us that that's going to be a silkworm site, so let's go ahead and verify that that is in fact correct. So we'll go waypoint designate. Alright, it's on the shore of Greater Tomb Island here, so that seems about right. We'll bring in the field of view of the pod and zoom on in, and it looks like he was right. That is definitely a silkworm site. But he's telling us we first need to make sure that we hit a ZSU-23's Shilka, which is located at waypoint 2. So first we'll just undesignate that point, brings the pod back into that snowplow mode, and we'll bring it up to waypoint 2. We'll hit waypoint designate again, and that is bringing us off towards that Shilka that he said was at waypoint 2. Now, we do see that that was off a little bit, but we can in fact see that we have an armored vehicle there, and when we look at it closely, that sure does in fact look like a Shilka. So we'll go ahead and pop it into point track mode, and we'll go ahead and engage that target. We want to get rid of that AAA threat before we do any other work around this island. But before we do that, why don't we take a look at the other waypoints that our F-14B AFAC has given us. Let's go ahead and take a look at waypoint 3. That should be the ramp of the little airbase here on Greater Tomb Island, showing us a couple Hueys on the ramp. And that looks about right as well as a group of armored vehicles at waypoint 4. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. We'll bring it up towards waypoint 4, and we'll hit waypoint designate again. We'll zoom it on out, and it looks like there is a bit of an armored vehicle right over here, maybe another one right here, and we'll worry about those guys in a little bit. So let's bring it back towards waypoint 2 in order to engage that Shilka and reduce the air-to-air threat that we're going to be seeing out here. So we'll go ahead and reacquire this target. We'll throw her into point track mode. There we go. And we'll go ahead and start bringing our Hornet on into the left. We'll go ahead and kick off the autopilot. As we roll the jet, you can see we are starting to mask the pod. And as we start to roll into our turn and start getting more and more nose on to our target, our pod is no longer masked. We'll go ahead and hit TDC depress to make sure that our mission computer is dropping our weapon in CCRP, constantly computed release point, on our Shilka target down there. We'll go ahead and turn off those dot labels down on the island just to reduce some ugliness. And we're flying right into the sun. Good thing I got my visor down. Alright, so we'll just line her up. And why don't we push up the throttles a little bit, gain a little extra speed. We're staying up high, just under 18,000 or just over 17,000 feet, making sure that we're outside of that manpad SAM envelope that's down there. We're definitely above the effective range of that Shilka we're engaging. And we're coming in. Weapon away. We'll go ahead and hit box trigger. We'll squeeze the trigger and start lasing that Shilka. And we'll come off the target off to our right hand side. Once again, we don't want to come off the target to the left because of the chance of masking our pod. We definitely don't want to mask that pod, especially when we have a bomb on the way to target and we're lasing that, because if the bomb loses sight of that laser spot for even a moment, the bomb will go stupid. And of course you run into issues of hitting unintended targets. Maybe they're friendly troops on the ground, maybe it's civilians, and looks like we got a good splash on that Shilka. So we can make sure that we turn off our laser by squeezing the trigger once again to make sure that we of course are not going to burn out that laser unit. It takes a ton of energy to actually fire the laser, and it will get hot. If you ever played with a laser pointer, you'll notice if you use it for quite a long time, it'll get hot. Same thing for the lasers that are not visible, but that are incredibly more powerful in our lightning targeting pod here. Now keep in mind, if you ever are going to play with a laser, do not ever shine a laser pointer at an aircraft in real life. I have unfortunately been the recipient of a laser while flying a real airplane, and it is of course not a good thing at all. So definitely don't do that. So we're flying away from the island here, back to DCS world of course, and we're going to go ahead and go back to our waypoint 1. We're going to designate waypoint 1, and we're going to drop a GBU-12 on the radar of a Shilka. Or sorry, the radar of a silkworm site. So that's our next target here. So keep in mind here that, you know, it's a tool to put in your toolbox of skills. If you say you're flying AFAC with a bunch of guys on a multiplayer server, and for some reason you can't get your laser to fire, or maybe there's a bug, maybe you did something wrong in the rearming process to get your targeting pod on your jet, but you can still pass your wingmen or any jets in the aircraft coordinates for those targets. You can always do that, and they can just use this very simple waypoint designation technique to find targets. Alrighty, so we got our pod unmasked here. We'll keep flying at the same altitude. We'll bring the view in. Oh, looks like we got masked again, that's alright. We'll just roll out and give ourselves a better chance. Unmask the pod, and we'll go for this radar van, if we can identify it from this far out. That sure looks like a radar van. So we'll go ahead and TDC to press, select that as our new target, and we'll go ahead and throw her in a point track. And bring the jet back on in. As I discussed in one of my previous videos, the targeting pod is very, very good because you can, of course, look at, find targets, identify targets, and designate targets while you're flying away from and perpendicular to target areas, so that way you don't have to always have your nose on and always be closing on targets as you're searching for things. Which is incredibly good for increasing your survivability on the battlefield, because you're not closing that distance and making it easier and easier and easier for a SAM to hit you. We do have kind of a long run-in for this target. I wouldn't recommend, in a real combat situation, having this long of a run-in to your target area. But for our purposes of demonstration, it definitely works. Alright, pressing the pickle button to authorize the release, and weapon away, and we'll start designating that radar trailer that's down there, searching for targets for those silkworm launchers. And we'll just gently come off the target, off to the right hand side. Should be coming in pretty soon. And splash. One radar van that is no longer going to be posing a threat to any civilian shipping within the Straits of Hormuz or the Persian Gulf. Alright. So we'll go ahead and undesignate waypoint 1 and bring our targeting pod back into snowplow mode. And before we go into VVSL, or Velocity Vector Slave mode, we're going to go ahead and set up our pod for using this mode. Now, when you set your pod up, you want to make sure you're in wide mode, and you also want to make sure that you zoom the pod all the way out, maybe 1 or 2 clicks in on the zoom. But for the most part, you want to have a bigger field of view when you're using VVSL mode, so that way you can walk your pod onto targets a little bit easier. So we'll go ahead and box VVSL, and we can see the view on the targeting pod changed, and it's now slaved to the velocity vector on our HUD out here. Now, back in early access, when the targeting pod first came out for the F-18, I think it was always in a sort of pseudo VVSL mode. Sometimes it seemed like it was slaved to the velocity vector. Sometimes it seemed like it was off from the velocity vector. So I'm not really sure what it was pointing at before, but now when you use it, it is definitely pointed at the velocity vector. So let's go ahead and bring the jet on back around. So let's say in our scenario here, our F-14 AFAC, he's really having a problem. That Rio's really having a problem with his targeting pod. And now for whatever reason, he's lost his GPS signal to that targeting pod. And now he can no longer pass us coordinates. But he can still see through the field of view of the targeting pod, and he can still describe to us where the targets are. So we'll go ahead and come on in. He's telling us, for instance, we've got some armored vehicles on the north end of the small runway on Greater Tomb Island. So using that, we can kind of have an idea of where that airport is on Greater Tomb Island, and we'll just bring our velocity vector over to the north end of that runway, and we'll search for those armored vehicles at the north end of the runway. And first we'll go ahead and get our Maverick set up and ready for an engagement. Alrighty, so we're bringing our velocity vector on over to the north end of the runway. Bringing it on in, we can kind of see a faint outline of a runway out there. So we'll go ahead and hit TDC depress, and we'll start slewing our pod on over to the north end of our runway. And we can definitely see some armored vehicles over here. So I'm going to go ahead and take this center one. We'll hit TDC depress again. We'll throw into point track mode. And we'll go ahead and bring our sensor select switch to the left-hand DDI to uncage our Maverick. We'll bring it back to the right-hand side, and we'll start firing our laser. We are in range. Our Maverick is locked. So we'll go ahead and hit rifle. And before we pull off our target, we're going to go ahead and sweeten up our picture just a little bit. That looks like a truck with maybe some sort of a AAA gun on it. And we'll make sure we're coming off to the right-hand side of the target so that we don't accidentally mask our target. And we'll kind of sweeten up that picture just a little bit, make sure we hit center mass on that truck. Yeah, it definitely looks like a truck with like a ZU-23 on it or something like that. Definitely another good threat to get rid of for any other coalition aircraft that might be in the area. And splash. So let's go ahead and pretend that those other vehicles there on that north end of the runway are also gone. So let's go ahead and recage our targeting pod, and we'll go ahead and box VVSL again, or velocity vector slave again, and this time we'll go ahead and slew it over the south end of the runway. Let's say our fictional AFAC, he's saying to us, I still can't give you coordinates, but if you slew over the southern end of the runway, you'll be able to see some more armored vehicles. And so we'll go ahead and follow his directions using our VVSL mode. And of course there's other ways to do this. We could of course just keep that same target point we had before and just slew the pod on over slowly down to the southern end of the runway. But, you know, for the purposes of our demonstration, this is what we're going to do. We'll go ahead and recage the Maverick for now. The sensor head was looking like he was a little confused for sure. And we'll go ahead and make about another 180 to 270 degree turn off to the right here. So that way the south end of the runway down there on Greater Tomb Island is not masked by smoke down there. It's caused by a fire. Maybe before that AFAC had an issue with his targeting pod, he was able to drop a couple GBUs on the island down there. So we'll go ahead and fly off in this direction for just a little bit longer, so that way we don't have that southern end of the runway masked by the smoke that's coming out. And we'll go ahead and roll on in. It looks like it's pretty clear in terms of smoke. And we'll zoom the pod out. And we'll bring it back to VVSL. Velocity vector scan mode, and we'll go ahead and walk the pod up to the southern end of the runway. And we'll hit TDC to press. We'll zoom the pod on in, and there we go. Presto, we've got some armored vehicles again. We'll slew it over. We'll hit TDC to press again. We'll start firing our laser for our Maverick to get locked onto. And we'll go ahead and rifle and start pulling off the target before we get too far over the island, because there may very well be some man pads down there that we do not want to get engaged by. And our Maverick's still streaking on down towards the target. Always coming off to the right hand side, and there's another shack on another armored vehicle. And there you have it. There's a little demonstration of those new pointer modes for the Lightning targeting pod on the A-18C. They will definitely help you guys acquire targets much easier and engage those targets much easier now that we have a way of getting the Lightning pod onto target in a much more user-friendly way than simply using the little dot that we have on the SA page or trying to guess as to where the pod is pointed on our HUD. Now that we have a good indication and true knowledge that it is in fact pointing at the velocity vector when in VVSL mode. So I hope you guys liked the video, and like I said earlier, everything in aviation and military aviation is all about thinking within the gray. You know, nothing's going to be black and white. It's all about using your skill set and your knowledge set that you've developed in order to make a decision and take action with the tools you have available in order to complete the mission, to get the aircraft safely back home in an emergency, or even decide to eject if the time is right to eject. So I hope you guys liked the video. Hope maybe you learned a little bit of something and liked the little scenario we kind of ran through. And fly safe, and as always, have fun with this fantastic and awesome simulator, guys. Thanks a lot.